He raised his hand and told me he would break my arm like it was nothing, like he was talking about the weather. And my husband, the man who promised to protect me, stood there and said nothing at all. I still remember the sound of the kitchen clock ticking that evening. Loud, too loud, like it was counting down to something none of us could stop. My name is Alina. I was 31 years old, married for almost 4 years, and up until that night I believed my life was, well, ordinary, not perfect, but safe. Safe was the word I used most back when I still had reasons to use it. I married Daniel in a small ceremony by the lake, the kind where you remember more of the laughter than the vows. His family welcomed me with open arms, or so I thought. His mother hugged me tight enough to leave a mark. His father called me daughter before we'd even finished the first dance. And his younger brother, Marcus. Marcus shook my hand and smiled, and I smiled back, not knowing that smile would haunt me for years. Marcus was 28, loud, charismatic, the kind of man who filled a room the second he walked into it, who told stories at dinner that made everyone laugh until their stomachs hurt. Daniel adored him, worshipped him, almost. Their parents had always treated Marcus like the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, the one whose mistakes were quietly swept under expensive rugs while Daniel's were held up under a magnifying glass. I didn't understand that dynamic at first. I thought it was just family stuff. Every family has its patterns, its old wounds nobody talks about. I told myself it wasn't my business. I was wrong. It became my business the day Marcus decided I was his to control too. It started small, the way it always does. Little comments about how I dressed. "You're wearing that to dinner." Little jabs about my job. I worked as a pediatric nurse, and Marcus liked to joke that I played doctor for a living, laughing like it was harmless, watching to see if it landed. Little digs at how I ran my own household, my curtains, my furniture, the way I seasoned food. Nothing that screamed danger, just enough to make me feel small in rooms I used to feel comfortable in. And every time I looked at Daniel, waited for him to say something, anything. He never did. "He's just teasing," Daniel would tell me afterward in the car, in the quiet dark where I finally let my shoulders drop. "That's just how he is. He doesn't mean anything by it." "It doesn't feel like teasing," I'd say. "You're too sensitive sometimes, Elle." He'd say it gently, never cruel, but gentle can cut just as deep when it's aimed at convincing you your pain isn't real. I started believing him, started believing maybe I was too sensitive. Maybe I was imagining the weight behind Marcus's words. Maybe I was the problem. That's the thing nobody tells you about slow erosion. You don't notice the ground disappearing beneath you until you're already falling. 2 years pass like that. Small comments becoming bigger ones. Marcus showing up uninvited to our home, letting himself in because Daniel had given him a spare key for emergencies. Except the emergencies always seemed to be dinner time, right when I'd just finished cooking, right when he'd help himself to a plate and comment on how it wasn't as good as Mom's. I brought it up to Daniel more times than I can count. "Can you talk to him about the key, about just showing up? He's my brother, Elle. I'm not going to make him feel like a stranger in my own house." "I feel like a stranger in my own house." Daniel would go quiet after that, not agreeing, not disagreeing, just quiet. That silence became its own language between us, a language I learned to dread. My father noticed before I even said anything. Dad had come to visit one Sunday in October, the kind of crisp fall afternoon where the light turns everything gold for an hour before dinner. He'd always had a way of watching people, really watching them, not just looking. He used to say that as a mechanic, you learn to hear the difference between an engine that's fine and an engine that's about to fail, even when it sounds almost the same to everyone else. He heard it in me that day, the almost. "You're quieter than you used to be," he said, while we sat on the porch steps, coffee cooling between our hands. "I'm just tired, Dad." Alina, just my name. He always used my full name when he wanted me to know he wasn't going to accept a surface answer. "I've known you your whole life. I know what tired looks like on you. This isn't tired." I almost told him then. The words were right there, sitting behind my teeth. But I swallowed them because some old, stubborn part of me still believed I could fix this myself, that I could smooth things over, keep the peace, be the version of myself that didn't cause problems. I wish I'd told him that day. It would have saved us both so much. The night everything broke open was supposed to be ordinary. Daniel's parents were hosting a birthday dinner for his mother, and the whole family had gathered, aunts, cousins, the usual noise and clatter of too many voices in one house. I'd spent the afternoon helping in the kitchen, the way I always did, trying to be useful, trying to belong somewhere I never quite felt like I belonged. Marcus arrived late, already a little loud, a little too pleased with himself about something. I didn't ask what. I'd learned not to ask. Dinner went fine, mostly. Laughter, plates passed around, Daniel's mother glowing under the candlelight of her own birthday cake. I remember thinking, just for a moment, that maybe things were okay. Maybe I'd been imagining the tension all along. Then Marcus brought up my father. I don't even remember exactly how it started. Something about self-made men and real jobs. Some comment dressed up as a joke that wasn't really a joke at all. He said my father was just a mechanic, said it with that particular curl in his voice, that specific kind of smile people wear when they want to hurt you but still want deniability. Something in me finally snapped. "Don't talk about my father like that," I said, quiet but clear. The table went still. Marcus turned to look at me, and for the first time in 2 years, the mask slipped completely. "Excuse me." "You heard me." He stood up so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor, the sound cutting through the room like something breaking. He crossed toward me, not far, just a few steps, but enough that everyone at that table felt the air change. "You want to talk about respect?" His voice had dropped low, the kind of low that's more frightening than shouting. "In my parents' house, at my mother's birthday." He leaned down toward me, close enough that I could feel the heat of his breath, close enough that instinct told my body to go still. "Say one more word to me like that, and I swear I will break your arm." The room didn't move. Nobody breathed. I looked past him, past his shoulder, straight at Daniel. I looked at my husband and waited for him to stand up, to say something, to do anything at all to prove that I mattered more to him than his brother's comfort. He looked down at his plate. And he said nothing. The silence stretched longer than any silence I had ever lived through. I could hear the clock again, that same ticking sound from my own kitchen echoing somewhere in my memory, except now it was happening in real time, in front of everyone who was supposed to love me. Daniel's mother finally spoke, her voice trembling somewhere between fear and denial. "Marcus, that's enough. Sit down." He sat, slowly, still glaring at me like I was the one who had done something wrong. I stood up from the table. My hands were shaking so hard I had to press them flat against my thighs just to steady them. I didn't cry. I remember being surprised by that, almost detached from my own body, like I was watching myself from somewhere near the ceiling. "Elena," Daniel started, finally finding his voice, now that the danger had already passed. "Don't," I said, "not now." I walked out of that house alone. Nobody followed me, not immediately. I sat in the car in the driveway for what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes, staring at the porch light, waiting to see if anyone would come out, waiting to see if my husband would choose me. He did come out eventually, got in the passenger seat because I was the one driving that night. He didn't say anything for the first few miles. Neither did I. "He didn't mean it," Daniel finally said. "He was just angry. People say things when they're angry." "He threatened to break my arm, Daniel." "I know, but—" "There is no but." My voice cracked on the word but, and I hated that it cracked, hated that even in that moment my body betrayed how much it hurt. "You sat there. You looked at your plate. You said nothing." "What did you want me to do? Start a fight at my mother's birthday?" "I wanted you to defend me," I said. "That's it. That's all I wanted." He didn't answer. And in some ways, his silence in that car was worse than his silence at the table, because now there was no excuse of surprise, no excuse of shock. He'd had 10 minutes to find the right words, and still, he found none. We didn't speak much over the following days. The apartment felt different, colder somehow, even though nothing about the temperature had changed. I went to work, came home, made dinner out of habit rather than love, and lay beside a man who felt more like a stranger with every passing night. I called my father 4 days later. I hadn't planned to tell him everything. I'd only meant to hear his voice, to borrow some of his steadiness for a few minutes. But he asked how I was doing, really asked, the way he always did, and everything I'd been holding back for 2 years finally broke. I told him about the comments, the uninvited visits, the years of feeling small in my own life. And I told him about that night, about Marcus's voice, low and cruel, about the words "break your arm," about Daniel's eyes on his plate instead of on me. My father didn't interrupt once. When I finished, there was a long pause on the line, long enough that I thought maybe the call had dropped. "Elena," he finally said, his voice quieter than I'd ever heard it, quieter and somehow harder at the same time. "I'm coming over tonight." "Dad, you don't have to." "I'm coming over," he repeated, and I knew from the tone that there was no arguing with him. He arrived within the hour, still in his work clothes, grease still faintly on his knuckles from a car he'd probably left half-finished in his garage. He hugged me at the door, longer than usual, and I felt something in my chest loosen just slightly, just enough to breathe. Daniel came out from the living room, looking uneasy in a way I'd rarely seen him. My father was a calm man, steady, the kind of man who rarely raised his voice because he never needed to. His presence alone carried weight. But that night, something in his eyes was different. Something had shifted. "Sit down, Daniel," my father said, not unkindly, but not a request either. Daniel sat. "I've known you for 6 years," my father began. "I welcomed you into my family. I trusted you with my daughter's heart because you looked me in the eye and told me that you'd take care of her. Do you remember that?" Daniel nodded, unable to meet his eyes. "Someone threatened to hurt my daughter," my father continued, his voice steady but with an edge underneath it, like metal wrapped in velvet. "In a room full of family, and you sat there and said nothing. Do you understand what that tells her? Do you understand what that tells me?" "I didn't want to make things worse," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Worse than a man threatening to break her arm?" My father leaned forward slightly. "Son, there is nothing worse than that. Nothing. And your silence told her that keeping the peace with your brother mattered more than her safety. That is what she heard, whether you meant it that way or not." I watched Daniel's face crumble, piece by piece, like something finally cracking under pressure it had been holding back for years. And for the first time since that night, I saw something that looked almost like shame. "I don't know how to fix this," Daniel said quietly. "You start," my father said, "by deciding, right now in front of both of us, what kind of man you want to be. Not what kind of brother, what kind of husband. Because you can't be both, not if being one means silence while the other one gets hurt." Nobody spoke for a long moment. I felt tears finally slide down my face, not from sadness exactly, but from something like relief. The relief of finally being seen, being defended, after 2 years of feeling invisible in my own life. "I'm sorry," Daniel said, looking at me now, really looking at me. "I'm so sorry, Elena. I let you down. I let Marcus treat you like that for years, and I told myself I was keeping the peace, but I was scared of my own family, scared of losing them, and I let that fear cost me you." "You didn't lose me," I said quietly. "Not yet, but you were close." The weeks that followed weren't easy. Daniel finally confronted Marcus, alone, without an audience, without a birthday cake to interrupt the conversation this time. I don't know everything that was said. I only know that Marcus didn't come to our home again after that, not for a long while, and when contact eventually resumed, months later, it was different. Distant. Careful. The kind of relationship built on boundaries instead of blind loyalty. Daniel started seeing a counselor, something I never expected from him, a man who used to say therapy was for other people. He told me once, months into it, that he'd spent his whole life being taught that keeping the family together meant staying silent, no matter the cost. That his parents had trained him, without ever meaning to believe that peace was more important than protection. "I'm learning that's not love," he told me one evening, sitting across from me at our kitchen table, the same table where I used to eat dinners feeling smaller each year. "Real love doesn't ask you to stay quiet while someone hurts the person you promised to protect. I won't pretend everything healed overnight. Trust doesn't rebuild on a timeline. There were nights I still lay awake, replaying that dinner, replaying the sound of Marcus's voice and the sight of Daniel's eyes on his plate. Some wounds take longer to close than others, and I gave myself permission to let mine take its time. But my father became something different to me after that night. Not just a parent, but proof. Proof that love isn't measured by how quiet you can keep a room, but by how loudly you're willing to stand up when someone you love is being hurt. He never raised his voice that evening. He didn't have to. Sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is speak calmly, clearly, and refuse to let silence win. I think about that a lot, even now. About how easily we mistake silence for peace, when really, silence can be its own kind of harm. About how the people who are supposed to protect us don't always show up the way we need them to, but sometimes, when we least expect it, someone does. Someone stands up. Someone reminds us that we were never wrong for wanting to be defended. My father drove home that night the same way he'd arrived, steady, quiet, unshaken. But he left something behind in that apartment that hadn't been there before. Not just courage. Clarity. The clarity to know that I deserved better than silence, and the strength, finally, to ask for it. And Daniel, slowly, imperfectly, but truly, began to become the man he'd promised to be, all those years ago, standing by a lake, making vows he hadn't yet understood the weight of. Some promises take longer to keep than others, but it's never too late to start keeping them.